de la carrera espacial en el contexto de la Guerra Fría, con Estados Unidos compitiendo con la Unión Soviética, la llegada del hombre a la Luna, a Elon Musk. ¿Sí? Elon Musk, este capitalista de nuevo cuño que ahora está en alianza con la NASA y lanzaron el proyecto SpaceX. ¿Qué pasa en el espacio cuando no son los estados nacionales los que protagonizan esa exploración y empieza a tallar el capital privado? Esta es la entrevista a Tissel Muir-Harmony, doctora en Historia de la Ciencia y la Tecnología por el MIT. La escuchamos. Good afternoon, Tissel Muir-Harmony. Thank you so much for being here with us in La Repregunta, el especial.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Well, Tissel, you are an expert in this very interesting field of trips to the moon, space diplomacy. First, we are very interested in understanding the importance of the first time humanity set foot on the moon. And you are the author of a book. It is Apollo to the Moon, A History of 50 Objects. Could you pick up 3 or 4 objects, artifacts that you consider they show clearly the legacy of this first trip to the moon?
One of my favorite artifacts is actually a very small artifact, and it's these little pieces of a piece of wood and a piece of fabric that Neil Armstrong brought to the moon with him. And they're actually from the Wright brothers airplane. So this is the first American airplane. It was flown at the beginning of the 20th century, and he brought pieces of that airplane with him to the moon. And I think it's a really special artifact because it connects those 2 moments in history, and then it also is a great reminder of how quickly we went from just learning how to fly airplanes to flying to the moon. So that's one of my favorites for sure. And then I love all of the artifacts in this book. Another
how many artifacts? Because you are the director of the Smithsonian Museum applied to air and space, no? So how many artifacts and objects from this first trip to the moon do you have in the collection?
For the Apollo 11 mission, which is the first trip to the moon, we have hundreds, and then from the Apollo program in general, there are thousands of artifacts. So I had many to choose from.
The decision of Neil Armstrong of carrying this piece of airplane from the Wright brothers was a strategical decision. Was he himself who decided to carry this piece of airplane, or it was a decision made by the NASA so as to give a message to humanity?
That was actually his decision. So he did that in consultation with the Air Force Museum. And he brought it up in what was called a personal preference kit. So it was a little bag, and the astronauts could bring whatever they liked with them to the moon. And many brought personal mementos or jewelry from their wives or things like that. So this was something that he planned. But NASA worked with the U.S. State Department and the White House, organizing a number of different sort of symbolic activities and things to be brought to the moon that would signal this message of that lunar exploration was for all humankind. And so one of the things that the United States did is they brought up miniature flags from every single country with them to the moon, and then they brought them back to Earth and gave them as gifts with pieces of moon rock. And so there's a gift presentation to Argentina with a flag, and then there was a lot of debate also about putting an American flag in the moon and whether or not that would signal territorial possession. It was seen as really problematic by the U.S. State Department, and it was highly debated. But they ended up,
absolutely, because you are also a specialist in space diplomacy, which sounds very, very appealing and interesting. which was the main goal of the United States when, well, in 1961, they decided to go to the moon within a decade. It was under this umbrella of the Cold War, United States versus Russia.
Mm-hmm. It was primarily a foreign relations program within this Cold War context. And so both the United States and the Soviet Union looked to spaceflight as a way to promote global alliance, to demonstrate the best of their respective political systems. And so President Kennedy was very explicit about why he pursued this goal of landing humans on the moon. And it was to win the hearts and minds of the world public. It was about larger global power, and it was part of U.S. grand strategy at the time.
So there is many information regarding the launching of a Sputnik from the Soviet Union and the idea that the United States decided to enter this space race when the government see this situation and these advances that Russians were doing. And it is also data analysis that relates this moment with the development of math teaching in the United States. Could you explain this to us? And could you relate the kind of legacy that the trip to the moon left to, for example, the United States in other terms, for example, this kind of cultural or social impact?
Sure. So after the Soviet Union launched the first satellite, Sputnik, in 1957, there was a lot of concern in the United States that the U.S. might be falling behind in terms of science and engineering and math. And so a number of different initiatives were undertaken, and that included the establishment of NASA, our space agency. But it also led to increased funding in science and math and engineering education within the United States. So there's this idea that there had to be more national investment in STEM fields because there was this risk of falling behind the Soviet Union. And it was seen as a major national priority. In that period within the United States in the 1950s and in the 1960s, science and technology was really linked to national identity and ideas of national power. And this was a legacy from World War II and the importance of science within fighting that war. So especially physics with the development of radar and nuclear weapons. And so there was this cultural legacy from World War II that associated science and technology with important aspects of American society at that time. So it was an important part of national priorities, I guess you would say. So one of the most important experiences or legacies of the first lunar landing was that half the world's population stopped what they were doing to watch the lunar landing in unison and to watch the first steps on the moon. And that, I think, is one of its most important legacies. Many of the astronauts will say, going to the moon, the most important thing they discovered was the Earth, and looking back on the Earth and recognizing that we all live just on one Earth together. And some said that they wish they could bring political leaders into space so they could look back on Earth and see there were no political boundaries. But at that time, there was this sentiment that one of the things that the lunar landing helped do was make it clear to people that we live on one world together, and that we should be a global community or think of each other as sort of citizens of the Earth, as opposed to people from different nations.
Do you think that this is the long-term legacy? Because you were explaining that the flag, the American flag in the moon, created some debate and on differences in points of view. Do you think that in the moment that the moon landing happened, the first way of understanding was how powerful the United States was compared to the Soviet Union?
I think that was part of it, but with a lot of the U.S. messaging at the time, by the late 1960s, it really shifted the focus away from competing with the Soviet Union and sort of the space race. You know, we got to beat the Soviet Union to the moon, and instead these messages of global connectedness. And so the United States, in addition to sending humans to the moon, created a massive communications infrastructure around the world, and this public relations campaign that helped people follow the moon landing. So the United States ensured that people could get television coverage or newspaper coverage. They set up tons of exhibits and did astronaut tours and really promoted the space program internationally very, very heavily through the 1960s to get people excited and engaged, to ensure that they would be watching that mission together. And the messaging there was really about global community, that this is for all humankind. And so as opposed to the competition with the Soviet Union, it was really about getting people to feel like they were participants in lunar exploration.
There is this very famous phrase of Neil Armstrong once he set foot on the moon. Could you remember this phrase? And tell us the story or the history of the phrase. It was created before. It was an idea that, there was consensus to say this once one of the astronauts finally set foot on the moon.
So one of the wonderful things about this very famous phrase, which is that's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind, is that we don't know too much of its history, and it's sort of a contested phrase. And so Armstrong was given the responsibility to determine what he was going to say himself, and there's some question about whether or not he got the line through conversations, or was it inspired by other people, or when he came up with it on his own, if it was before the mission or in the moment, or we don't quite know. But one of the important parts of that history is that NASA did not script the line, and that was a big part of what the U.S. was trying to symbolize through the mission, was that the American program was open. So this was one of the ways the United States contrasted with the Soviet Union, is to be very, very open and in a number of different sort of aspects of the program. So televising launches, inviting the press to witness launches in different parts of the mission, and then having the astronauts, encouraging them to say what they wanted to say. And that was also the case in other missions. There are some other famous lines, and they're scripted by the astronauts, or the astronauts were able to consult with other people, but it was up to them to figure out what they should say.
How long it took in that time to go from Earth to the moon?
About 3 days.
3 days.
Over 3 days.
What about these rumors that have been running over the years that there was a kind of, differences in points of view regarding who would be the first astronauts to set foot on the moon? Is it true? What happened there in the middle of the space in the moon among these three astronauts, these three heroes, of course?
So it was determined before they launched, before they even really started training for the mission, who would be the first person to step foot on the moon, and that was the commander, Neil Armstrong. He was given, as the commander of the mission, it was up to him. He was a great choice. There's some speculation in his biography that part of the reason that he was given that responsibility was because he was such an incredible ambassador of the space program. And before that mission, he had toured South America after his Gemini mission, and he did a wonderful job of engaging with people, and he learned some Spanish, and he was really able to connect with people around the world. Was really wonderful at giving speeches and learning about local history, and so there's some speculation that's part of the reason he was chosen to be the first person to walk on the moon, because he really was able to engage with the global audience in a special way.
And how did this speculation of an argument among these three astronauts was created, appeared?
There was some tension. I don't think Mike Collins participated in that. He knew he was the command module pilot, which meant that he was going to stay inside the command module orbiting the moon while Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed on the moon in the lunar module. So he wasn't part of that debate. Aldrin did, I think he would have liked to be the first person on the moon. And I know that he and some of his family advocated for that a bit, but it didn't go very far. It was clear that it was going to be Armstrong.
Tisal, we have witnessed the last launching of the SpaceX NASA spacecraft a couple of some weeks ago, and one of the things that appealed the attention of the TV transmission broadcasting was this dinosaur floating in the middle of the spacecraft called Tremor, the dinosaur that one of the astronauts decided to carry. Why these kind of toys are important for the trips to the space?
There are great stories throughout the history of space exploration of special mementos that astronauts will bring with them, and other toys have flown in space, and it connects to, I think, people on Earth as well. One of the most important elements of human space flight is that people are able to relate to it, and that it connects to us in a different way, that we are able to imagine what that experience would be like. And with robotic spacecraft, it's often said that it's less of a human connection. And I think when the astronauts bring toys or mementos or do things in space like play music, it helps us on Earth get a sense of what it would be like to be there. And it's a very distinctive part of human exploration.
Does it have some kind of connection with the science in terms that they show this kind of toy show when the spacecraft is reaching zero gravity levels?
It definitely can demonstrate sort of principles of physics, that's for sure. And I think it does a great job of that for kids in particular, getting them interested and engaged. There's a story from the Apollo program that one of the astronauts actually brought a golf club with him to the moon and golfed on the moon. And he, part of how he justified it was he said, it's testing gravity and as an experiment, but I think he also thought it would be fun to play on the moon. So it's this combination of sort of motivations.
And size. This new phase of the space exploration and space enterprise with the private sector involved and in a very unique alliance with NASA, what does it mean in terms of the kind of diplomacy and the kind of negotiations that are now being developed? Because I think that before, when the states were in charge and governments were in charge of the trips to the space, no matter it is to the moon or the exploration of Mars or the going to the international station, the space station, is different the kind of conversation that governments could have, and a very different one is the conversation with a private leader like Elon Musk, I think, and it changed the way diplomacy works in space. Could you describe and analyze this for us?
It'll be interesting to see how it evolves, and I think we're at a moment where space exploration is going to change quite a lot. So with the United States' relationship with SpaceX, and especially when it comes to sending humans to the International Space Station, the U.S. is a major funder of the development of that program, and it pays for services. So it pays for the whole system, the rocket and the spacecraft, and to get the astronauts there. But it is still primarily motivated by and funded by U.S. government interests, and all launches within the United States are heavily regulated and have to go through this larger system. So I don't know how much in the immediate near-term future it's going to impact things like space diplomacy. It could make access to the International Space Station less costly, and that could be really important for opening the access to more people from more countries. That's a question. But space exploration in general tends to be quite costly, and and doing things like reducing the cost of launches and shuttling people, either whether it's from the space station or somewhere like the moon in the future. Decreasing those costs will likely give more people access and more countries access to space. The U.S.'s investment in SpaceX has also helped them develop the Falcon 9 rocket, which is the one they used to go to the space station. And that has become a major player in commercial launches and launching satellites. And so that's disrupting the larger sort of international launch competition in terms of economics.
Tisel, when the President Kennedy in the 1960s proposed this dream to the USA citizens of going to the moon, you explained that it was related to a geopolitical point of view and geopolitical strategy. Would you say that today is much more related to financial issues and budget issues and not that related with to strategical decisions, geopolitical decisions?
It's a very, very different context, and I don't think that we're motivated by quite the same factors as Kennedy would have been in 1961. Is a very different global situation. When it comes to the American space program, there are a number of different elements, and it's important to separate those out when we talk about what motivates them. And human spaceflight is just one of the areas of the American space program. And I think currently that's a lot of that has to do with national identity and pride. And I think a lot of it's directed to a domestic audience within the United States. I think during the Apollo era, in the 1960s, the United States was very, very concerned about what the world thought of the States and its policies, and wanted to be really prioritize being a good friend or a leader to the world public. I think that priorities have shifted now, and human spaceflight is not sort of utilized for the same primary purposes. I think that's an element of it, but I think that it's really much more about here in the United States. Right before this last launch, there was a lot of talk about how important it was to launch from American soil. And I think that's a much more domestic, sort of inward-looking message than it is an outward-looking one, which is what we had in the 1960s.
And Tisel, the last question is related to the implications of the private sector entering in the space race, because what I have been reading about this dinosaur tremor, and what appealed my attention is that this plush toy, was sold out because it was an old line of a trade of company. It was not for sale, but for a couple of hours, SpaceX website offer the toy at a very higher price compared to the one that the toy was sold. So is there any kind of risk in terms of the way the space is included in the capitalism logics of buying and selling commodities?
That's a great question, and that is going to be a major issue, because during the Apollo era, there was an important relationship between the U.S. government, between NASA and private space industry. So 94% of people working on Project Apollo were actually contractors and subcontractors working within American industry. But the major difference between that and today is that the U.S. is paying for services, and SpaceX is responsible for much more than private industry contractor would have been in the past. So for the entire system, so the rocket and the spacecraft. And there was a question raised for me when the astronauts rode a Tesla out to the launch pad. And there's this long history of them riding the Astrovan, which is not connected to the company that has its logo on the rocket.
Yes.
So we're at a point where the NASA has, I think, less direct control in the kinds of things like the branding and some of the messaging because of this new relationship to commercial spaceflight and industry. And I think that there are going to be long-term implications of that. I think it's a major question for me, especially because when it comes to human spaceflight, it's so much of it has been driven by national interests. It's funded by government primarily, and it's so expensive that seems like that'll be the major player in the future, and especially the near future. So when things get shifted like this with this new relationship, I think that there are large implications, and things are. We'll see. We're very much at the beginning of this new relationship. But
it's an open question, this one.
It's an open question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Tisal Muir-Harmony, for this very interesting analysis of the space after the moon landing, before, and the future. Thank you.
My pleasure.